Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Samanthropolitics, your source for global politics and women's rights coverage, where you get exposure to things going on in the world that are hard to get the news on, and always looking at what is the role of women and girls, where are women and girls in the news. Today's show, I'm really excited because we're going to have the viewpoint of kind of the US government high level, and then we're also going to have the grassroots perspective on the war in Yemen. Now, usually you have one or the other. You either have kind of like the high level diplomatic view, or you have the grassroots nonprofits working at the community level view. And we're going to have both in this episode from a senior level diplomat who was the political and econ chief in the US Embassy in Yemen for 2 years, and also from somebody who's been working directly on the ground with populations in Yemen on track 2, track 3 dialogues and in community building. So really unique conversation today on Yemen. And I have to give a shout out to my friend James from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And that's one of the organizations represented tonight, because James said, I'm just so angry about Yemen because I feel like it's the forgotten war and nobody knows about it. And in my mission of helping everybody here to understand what else is going on in the world, I thought it was important to cover it. So thanks, James, for picking on me and telling me that this is something I should cover. In other news, before we get started on Yemen, Trump was not impeached, as many of you know. What I find really amusing about the Republican argument for why Trump wouldn't be impeached was that a former president could not be impeached. So, they watched all the videos, they watched all the testimony, they saw all these horrible things happening. They saw like clear evidence that Trump had incited the riots, and yet they didn't even respond to any of that. Like, no, he didn't incite it. They were just like, oh, well, a former president can't be impeached, so that's our argument. So it kind of makes me wonder, like, if this had happened before January 20th, what would have happened? Would they have come up with some other stupid argument? The good news, though, for the Democrats out there is that Trump still faces legal battles all over the country. He is being prosecuted in a million different courts for all sorts of different things. Like, he is in so many legal battles, it's not even funny. And the Supreme Court also, in a very exciting ruling, said that he has to turn over his tax return. So he's been trying to not turn over his tax returns for years and years and years. The New York Times had gotten some of them and published some of them, but we have not seen his full tax returns, which is very unique for any president. And we're finally going to see his tax returns. Something else that is going on, we covered with the situation in Burma, and one of the predictions was that people were not going to protest because of the military will take a hard line there. And that's exactly what has actually happened, is that hundreds of thousands of people are continuing to protest. So people have come out on the streets. And as predicted, the military has not been soft on protesters. And many times they've shot into crowds of protesters, killing all of these protesters who have then become symbols and martyrs for the movement in Burma. But the people are not going to sit back and kind of let this military coup just go into effect and all of a sudden go back into military dictatorship. I think especially after tasting democracy, it's like they've had a pseudo democracy for 20 or so years, and now all of a sudden to say, oh, just kidding, we're going back to the way we were, is like a huge shock to the system. Like, I thought we were free. Just kidding. No, we're not. Something else really interesting that happened that is breaking news is that a German court was trying and 2 former Syrian intelligence officials. Now, it's kind of confusing. How was a German court trying Syrian intel officials? And it was because the Syrian officials got asylum as refugees into Germany, and then they were arrested and found to have been Syrian intelligence officers. Germany's really good at finding these people, like post-Holocaust, finding all of the kind of SS officers that were responsible for mass atrocity in the Holocaust. So one of them was sentenced today to 4.5 years in jail for complicity in crimes against humanity. And the case was that he'd helped to arrest protesters in 2011 who were later tortured and murdered. Now, this case was not only about prosecuting this particular person, and there's one other guy, Anwar Roslan, also on trial. It was also about having the opportunity to not only build up this case against Assad and his regime, but to have this broader body of evidence against them and to expose it to the world through, there were hours and hours of witness testimony. And just from my exposure to Syria, working with a Syrian journalist on the ground, I mean, even just him, he was imprisoned, taking photos, he was tortured. They told him he could only get out of jail if he signed something saying he was a terrorist. He didn't. He was left on the floor with no water, no food. They had to drink out of the toilets in order to survive. They were given electric shocks. He finally was able to bribe someone to get out. And then in a barrel bomb, his limbs were shattered, and he's been rehabbing for the past 2 years. So what Syrians have faced within Syrian prisons is just astonishingly horrific and disgusting. And women have been raped. And so, it's exciting that even though it's, not a long sentence, it's only 4.5 years for all these horrendous, horrendous crimes, it's still a legal landmark. And it's really exciting in terms of people really trying to get justice for the atrocities in Syria. So another guy still is on trial, so we'll see what happens to him. It's also cool seeing something besides the ICC trying people for crimes against humanity. So now we're going to go across the world to Yemen. So you can start that slideshow, Zach, to show people what's going on in Yemen. I do want to give a trigger warning. If you're watching with kids, there are some very graphic photos of malnourished children in this slideshow. I would not have you see them. I have trouble seeing them. The first time that I was exposed to Yemen was reading an article about malnourished children that were dying from preventable causes. And I literally had nightmares for a week of those pictures of kids with their bones sticking out. And what's just so sad, it's like it's totally preventable. This is not some kind of disease. This is literally because they do not have enough food or water to eat. It's really, really upsetting. And there's a giant humanitarian crisis happening there. But let's go back to the beginning. So what happened in Yemen? How did this conflict start? So it started with the Arab Spring, which I'm sure many of you had heard of, where many populations in the Arab world rose up against authoritarian governments and said no more. Now, the Yemeni president at the time, Ali Abdel Salah, was forced out after 3 decades in power in 2011, and power was handed over to his deputy, Mansour Hadi. So the Houthi movement, which was a movement within Yemen, took advantage of this power movement, and they took control of northern Yemen and ultimately the capital Sana'a. The interesting kind of tricky part is that with all of this, the old president, Ali Abdel Salah, was supposed to be out of the game, but he all of a sudden started backing the Houthi rebels. So he was supporting them to then take over, probably because he was pissed off that he was ousted from power. So Saudi and Arabia and 8 other countries believed that the Houthi rebels were backed by Shia Iran, and so they began an air campaign against the Houthis. So if you're wondering why did this happen, it's really that belief that Iran is part of this, that's how it really became a regional conflict. Meanwhile, what happens in countries when there's a huge power vacuum and there's really no one in charge and there's no services, there's no public services, is that it's kind of like a race for control. It's like, oh, nobody's in charge. Like the judicial system's all crashed, so there's no way to get accountability for anything. It's almost lawless in a sense. And so what happens is that all these other groups start to vie for power. So Al-Qaeda and then IS also entered the chaos, starting to carry out deadly attacks in Yemen's south. Now, what was the role of the US government? Well, the US and the Saudi Arabia have been allies for a very long time. And so we supported the air campaign for years, kind of without much question, although we can ask Joanne that, until the brutal death of an American resident named Jamal Khashoggi. You might remember Jamal. He was a Washington Post writer, and he went into the Saudi embassy in Turkey for a visa or something like that and never came out. And it was discovered that he was literally hacked to death by the Saudis under the direction of the Saudi prince. I mean, so like this is stuff you're like, this happens? Like this is still happening in the world? Like, how is this possible? You walk into an embassy and you're hacked to death? Like, what the actual, you know what? So after that happened, finally America was like, okay, I don't think the Saudis' moral alignment is exactly, I don't think their values are actually kind of aligned with ours after seeing how they hacked to death one of our residents. So we should maybe take a look at this and see what the heck is going on. So finally, Bernie Sanders actually finally brought it up, but there was finally a congressional call to stop our support to the Saudis, recognizing that our support was helping them to fuel the humanitarian disaster, to prolong the war there, and to kill people on the ground because the Saudis were pretty indiscriminate with regards to their airstrikes. So congressional bipartisan call said, let's stop support to the Saudis. So it was bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans said, let's stop it. But of course, Trump vetoed the bipartisan legislation because he's Trump under some ridiculous rationale that made no sense. Okay, so Biden comes into power. What is happening now? Well, one of the first action that Biden took was saying, enough is enough. Let's get rid of this Trump veto and pass this legislation. We're stopping to support Saudi Arabia. This war can go on no longer. The Biden administration also revoked the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Now, that's important because in the American foreign policy kind of community, you're not allowed to negotiate with terrorists. And so by having them designated as terrorists, it had to do with our negotiations with them and our ability to negotiate ceasefires and a peace process. He's also appointed a respected career diplomat as the special US envoy to Yemen, which I think signifies that this administration is about putting an end to this war. And they're really shifting our priority on the war from a military support to more diplomatic support to level one talks and hopefully to organizations like James's and Rebecca's International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, supporting these grassroots mobilization efforts to bring peace. So what's the state of the country? Well, it's been in constant fighting for about 7 years. And so the infrastructure, the judicial system, and basic services have crumbled. That's also a way that terrorist organizations sometimes are able to get a foothold within a power vacuum. If the government isn't able to provide services, like basic services like water and food, and then a terrorist organization steps in and says, oh, we'll provide water and food, then people start to ally themselves to the group that's providing them water and food and can overlook the horrible things that they're doing because they need to eat and they're not getting it from the government. So it's kind of important to understand about how do terrorist groups sometimes gain the support of civilian populations. So Yemen is now gripped in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 2/3 of the population, 2/3, 2 out of every 3, suffering from food insecurity. It means they cannot put enough food on the table for dinner. And there's children dying every day of completely preventable causes of malnutrition. Now, this crisis has been exacerbated. There used to be all of the Arab countries that were giving to Saudi Arabia, to the Yemeni crisis, I think as a way to palliate their own consciences for fueling the war there, had economic difficulties with COVID and drew out a lot of their economic support. So one thing Joanne's going to talk about is this upcoming kind of donor conference that's almost like a silent auction where everyone comes forward, or like a live auction and says, I'm going to give this amount of money to the Yemeni relief, and the US is really leading that effort. But 80% of the population, which is 24 million people, need humanitarian assistance and protection. 20 million people need help securing food, and according to the United Nations, almost 10 million of them are considered one step away from famine. There's about 400,000 children under 5 years old who are struggling to survive. And about only half of the country's medical facilities are actually functioning. 18 million people do not have access to clean water or adequate sanitation. Another problem with the war in Yemen is that women are facing rising violence. 83% of displaced people in Yemen are women and children, and the support that they might already get if they're at high risk of violence is now gone. And then displacement of women and children makes them vulnerable to armed groups. So you have a lot of women and children experiencing violence and displacement, which is really upsetting as well. Okay, so that being said, oh, and the last thing to say is that COVID really ravaged the country, and there was really no health system to support people who had COVID. So take this humanitarian crisis that's like already horrible, and then that's just like throw in a global pandemic, and it's a disaster. Really, really a huge disaster. I mean, we saw even in the U.S. with a functioning health system how bad it's been here in terms of the death rate, and there with a very, very limited health system, it was catastrophic. So without further ado, let's bring in the real expert. I just wanted to give a little bit of background because I know that I was like, who are all these people? Who are all these groups in the war? And so I wanted to give you all an understanding of that as well. So I'm going to bring in our first guest, who I'm incredibly excited to have, an extremely brilliant woman with a storied career in the Foreign Service. She's currently an adjunct professor at Baylor University, where she teaches about Middle East politics. And she was recently the foreign policy advisor to CGTF-OIR based in Baghdad. As the daughter of a diplomat, she was raised in Lebanon, lived in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, finished high school in Tehran, and graduated from university in Beirut, Lebanon. And then she gained an MA from the University of Texas at Austin. Not very different from Lebanon and Iran. I love that. At the State Department, she's worked in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Jerusalem, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Cyprus, Ethiopia, and Micronesia, as well as 9 years working regionally from Morocco through Pakistan. She was also the deputy chief of mission in the Federated States of Micronesia, and she was the Pol-Econ section chief at the U.S. Embassy in Yemen for 2 years during the conflict. And she's been a political officer, a consular officer, econ section chief, and a refugee coordinator. She speaks Arabic and French. So Joanne, I am delighted to bring you in here. Let me just get you in.
Hi there.
Joanne.
I am so glad that this worked.
I'm so delighted to have Joanne. And as this is a live stream to the audience, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to get them answered. So
I'm all yours, Samantha.
Thanks, Joanne. So let's just start with your experience. You were the Pol-Econ chief during the war at the U.S. Embassy in Yemen. First of all, what was that like? I mean, you're deployed to this place that's in a humanitarian crisis, is like all these fractious groups. There's a total power vacuum. How did you do that?
Well, it was kind of interesting because before being in Yemen, I was in Syria. I went to Syria when things were calm, and then there was Arab Spring, and then there was a civil war. And then I went to Yemen, where there was some hope because there was this peaceful transfer of power after Arab Spring. And then there was a civil war. And I seriously started to feel that I should be careful where I go, because obviously I am bringing civil war.
That's obvious, man. It's clearly following you.
Yeah.
That's exactly
then
what I was thinking.
But the critical thing at that time was that I was there initially during this brief moment when the tensions of Arab Spring and the massive protest movements and the crowds living in squares all around the country for weeks and months on end, and then the violence against them, that had been resolved through a UN and US broker deal. And we moved into a phase where there was a national dialogue, and it really included lots and lots of people. There were arguments about how they were chosen, did they have the right people? But in truth, there were people from all around the country, different classes, different religions, different political orientations, men, women. It was really quite remarkable. And it included both people who supported Saleh and people who supported the Houthis, and people who were Salafis, very conservative Muslims, and people who were tribal, and people from the south and the north. So that was all going on. But at the same time, there were tensions on the ground. And so at the embassy, we wound up all moving into one hotel that we eventually took over. Initially, it was still run by Sheraton, and all of us got so many Sheraton points. It was amazing. And then the State Department said, why are we paying all this money to Sheraton? We will just take over management of it. So they put a lot of work into renovating and doing all that stuff. And then, of course, we all had to leave. So, it's the way it goes. But there were times when we were evacuated a couple of times. I spent 3 months living in my office on the floor, sleeping under my desk.
Wow.
So, it was an interesting time, because at some times I could go out and have meetings with people in restaurants, and at other times we were totally shut down. But life went on. And that's the thing that we often forget when we start talking about, well, what was it like for you as a diplomat living there? Because that's not really relevant. What's relevant is what life was going on. And there were tensions and there were attacks, but it was not war, right? Particularly during the national dialogue. Now, the tricky bit is that during that deal, when the UN and others convinced Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down as president, there were certain groups that were part of that deal and signed off on the deal. What we call the Houthis was not one of them, because they said, this is a foreign thing. This is the UN. This is the United States. These foreigners shouldn't be telling us what to do. So they stood aside. But they did take part in the national dialogue, and they took part in the working groups. They took part in the discussions about the Constitution and the economic system and regional dynamics and all the rest of it. So shall I just continue on, or do you want to ask me more questions?
Well, so Joanne, with regards to that, I know speaking before, you said, that was important because that some people say, oh, we can't get these people to dialogue with each other. We can't get them to agree on anything. Like it's a waste of time. So knowing that during this national political dialogue, there was conversation, there were people in the same room from these different groups, like it is possible to come to a resolution. Is that what kind of your conclusion is from being part of the national dialogues?
Yes, in the sense that it is absolutely manifestly possible for people to meet together with each other and to have those discussions. Now, remember, there had already been a series of relatively short but violent wars between the Houthis and Saleh in Sana'a. So for them all to come together, these were already people who had been through war and bombing of each other and all sorts of violence. I think it is important, as you're pointing out, to whenever we think, well, what can you do? They've just been at war forever. No, they have not. They have not been a well-functioning state, but they have had times when they were perfectly capable of coming together, either in small meetings or in this national dialogue that was quite huge. And we have to remember that although they're not exactly the same thing, the group that we call the Houthis or Ansar Allah is also part of the group that was the ruling imamate of Yemen for about 1,000 years, right? Right up until the 60s. So they definitely don't see themselves as something irrelevant to the future of the country. I see a question. Do you want me to answer as I go, or do you want to read it out and decide what we do with it?
Oh, this is an interesting question. So I like, so I will say the question, Al, thank you for the question, but it's definitely, I'm going to ask it in a little more of a diplomatic way. I think there's worry that so part of Trump's kind of whole posture towards the Houthis was because they were backed by Iran, and Trump wanted to have this hardline policy against Iran. So we have a question now that the Biden administration has kind of said, okay, we want to broker a peace deal. We're going to stop supporting the war in the Saudis. I think that there's worry, like from our guest here, who says, is the Biden administration surrendering to the Iranian-backed Houthis?
And it is a question that people ask. And if you give me just a second, let me step back and point out that this conflict became regionalized. Iran got involved. Saudi Arabia got involved. We can argue about who did it first. But the things that are happening in Yemen are being done by Yemenis for Yemeni reasons. The Houthis are doing Houthi things for Houthi reasons. The other groups are doing things for reasons that are intrinsic to Yemen. But over the time that I was there, in just that 2 years, I heard the rhetoric change from, yeah, we kind of worship all in the same mosque and everything's cool. You're you and I'm me, but you know, we're all basically Yemeni, to Sunni, Shia, and derogatory terms for each that I won't use in the show. So the challenge,
so this kind of ethnic identity came out that hadn't been there before, it sounds like.
Specifically sectarian identity. Mm-hmm. Now, as Yemen, as Iran and Saudi Arabia offer support or arms in each case, it encourages the other to also be more engaged. So there is no way of peeling it back, of de-regionalizing the conflict without reaching an understanding that we have to address the issues that are in Yemen, that are about Yemen. If we, as the United States, only look at Yemen in terms of Iran and Saudi Arabia, there won't be a solution within the country itself.
What do you see as the main issues within Yemen that you think the Yemenis are really upset about? Or
well, there are quite a few, because Ali Abdullah Saleh managed to keep control by keeping everyone at each other's throats, but just under the surface. So he was not trying to make everything go well. He was trying to control the country. The challenge in Yemen is that you have a long history. And there are parts of the country that have been largely under tribal control because Saleh didn't want to be bothered. You have Southerners who are angry about a somewhat failed unification that they felt didn't get them what was promised. You have the Houthis in the far north who are frustrated because they are not recognized as being a significant historical part of the country. So, and of course, you have terrorist groups that are taking advantage of all these different things. Although Al-Qaeda was definitely doing stuff under Saleh, and you could suggest that Saleh didn't go out of his way to stop them, because as long as al-Qaeda was in Yemen, Saleh got assistance from the United States.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. So he didn't have an incentive to really get rid of them because he was getting money to fight them.
And particularly since his relatives were in charge of the various military elements that were receiving the training and the weapons and the money. Yeah.
So let's go forward here. So what do you think, what needs to happen now? There's been an intensification of fighting, several ceasefires, the Riyadh agreement, we've got a new administration. What do you think that the Biden administration needs to do to get this to end and to ameliorate the humanitarian crisis, frankly?
And I think you've touched on the two major things there. One is there is a new, more integrated Hadi government, which is the legitimate, internationally recognized government. And at the same time, there's a recognition, again, in the United States, that a major humanitarian catastrophe is neither good for Yemen nor for the rest of the world. It's vital that the countries of the region and the countries of the world come together to address this issue. The population of Yemen is similar to the population of Syria. This is a large country. We tend to think it's small because we don't know anything about it. Actually, it's not. And the high-level donors conference is going to take place on March 1st is an opportunity for people to truly come together to address the things that will keep people angry. Not having food, when you blame someone else for you not having food, will make you angry. It happens all over the world. On the other hand, Yemenis...
Is that what's called being hangry? I think a lot of viewers know what it's like to be hangry.
Yeah, except for a decade at a time. I think that's a really good point. We should talk about national hanger. Go with that thought. So we've got kind of a short window here where, Tim Linderking is coming in as a special envoy. He's got deep experience and connections and knowledge in the region. Europe is deeply engaged. The countries of the region are realizing that what they've been doing is not going to work. We are in a position of telling Saudi Arabia, look, let's have a normal relationship where we have a voice in how you use our armaments. And getting in there is very important. This is one of the reasons that the Biden administration revoked the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Because once you do that, you, in many ways, hurt yourself more than them. The Houthis don't have money in the United States. They're not flying around on airplanes. What we are doing is saying that we and any donors that we give money to cannot assist in humanitarian efforts in any area where the Houthis are. That's not going to help us peel people away.
So there was a humanitarian desert in areas that were controlled by the Houthis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was opposed by people across the government, from security people to humanitarian people. And it had not really been put into practice. And so there's not a lot of dislocation in revoking it. And it was the right thing to do.
So thinking about going to women, since this show, we talk about women's rights a lot. What was it like as a woman serving in the Gulf region? And, some men say, terrible place for a woman to be, like, you can't get anything done. And why do you think a woman's perspective was important to have in the region?
You know, it's such a good question because pretty much anytime I talk to a group, that's something they ask. What was it like being a woman in the Arab world? It's like, first, the Arab world is really big, and even the Gulf is not homogeneous. But I have found being a woman to actually be an enormous advantage throughout my life because as an official, I can talk to all the men. As a woman, I can talk to all the women, and that's really important in regions or countries or parts of countries that are more traditional. Because if I'm a man and I go out and I talk to the men, but I don't necessarily understand the community. And women are often have a very deep insight into what the issues are. May I tell my story about
I love this story. Yes,
all right.
tell the story. Tell the story, Joanne. We're all ears.
When I was the refugee coordinator at the embassy in Baghdad, when the embassy first opened, I spent a lot of time doing field work. So I would go out to displacement sites, and they're never nice places because all the nice places have been taken. So I was visiting one, and this is IDPs, and they were just in this arid plain in tents. And I went, and I do speak Arabic, and so I had tea with the elders, and developed some. I wanted them to have confidence in me and to be comfortable with me talking about these issues. And so after we'd done that, I said, so what are your challenges? What are your needs? And they said, well, what we need is a generator with and fuel trucks that will come periodically to give us fuel for the generator because there's no electricity here. I said, okay.
So this is a group of all men that are telling you we need generators.
Of course. The elders, men, synonymous, right? So I said, what do you need that for? And they said, well, we want to have those small refrigerators to keep the food safe for the children. I was like, this is plausible. This, tugs at my heartstrings, children. And so then I said, and also as a woman, I'd like to pay respects to your older women, your elders among the women. And they kind of looked at each other and said, no, it's okay. We represent everybody. We represent the men and the women and the children, everybody. Okay. And I said, I understand that and I appreciate everything you're doing, but I just would like to say hello to the women. So they went off and got a group of the senior women together, and they're sort of standing in a half circle facing me, and the men are standing in a half circle behind them. And I realized this is not going to be a very candid conversation. So I love
that. The men are just standing behind the women like their parents, just like listening to their kids talk to their psychologist or something. It's like hysterical.
Exactly. Funny. And so I said, how am I going to change this? So I said to the women, I would like to speak to you about childbirth. And the men just evaporated. They just disappeared. They turned, they walked away. They wanted nothing to do with this discussion about, women's bodies and childbirth. So once they were gone, I smiled at the women.
Childbirth and periods. Like all you have to do is say anything about childbirth or periods, and they're like, bye. Okay, bye. We'll see you later. See you later.
Yep, exactly. So I asked the women, what are your challenges and what do you need? And they said, we really need a water truck because women and girls have to walk really long distances to go and get water. There's no water here. And they're being attacked and they're being assaulted and it's very dangerous. And yet we have no alternatives. So the thing that would make the difference for us is to have water. And I said, well, that certainly makes sense to me. But the men said that you needed a generator. And they just kind of looked at each other and started laughing. And they said they want to watch TV. So I realized that if I had been a man, or if I had simply talked to the men, I would have believed that I was doing the right thing, because I'm talking to the men and they represent everybody. But in fact, they don't. So I and many of my female colleagues would say the same thing, that we bring much, much more in some cases than men do, because we do have this ability to move all the way across a culture, all the way across a group of people, and learn a great deal more about what's actually going on.
So interesting, and I think it just shows how men they don't have really an awareness of the problems that women are facing, or the acute violence, or they don't care, or both.
It is not unique to the Arab world.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's a common problem, that when women are walking to water, they're potentially exposed to violence.
Absolutely.
So I have one more question for you, and then I want to bring Rebecca in to ask her a few questions. Then I'm going to bring you back together. So one thing that I thought was really important that you said is that we're not just talking about in Yemen just feeding hungry people, right? It's the country is like kind of in shambles, and you said the longer that you have food insecurity, the harder it is for a country to rebuild itself. Can you explain why?
Sure. We tend to think of hunger as, I have not had food, I'm hungry, I go eat, and then I'm okay. Long-term food insecurity affects people very, very differently, particularly pregnant women, babies, children, people who are in that development phase, because it has long-term and permanent effects on physical growth, physical stamina, intellectual abilities, other kinds of disabilities, and you can't make that go away by starting to give someone food when they're 12 years old. So when we're talking about rebuilding a country, we may have people who are 30 and older who are fine, but we may have a younger generation. And remember, in Yemen, like in many countries, the majority of people are 25 and under, who are not everything they could be. Every day, every week, every month that they don't have food makes the world's effort to help Yemen recover more difficult. This is incredibly urgent.
So yeah, having malnutrition can cause mental retardation, developmental difficulties, all these kinds of things where children don't develop normally as they should. And and I think the saddest part is that it's entirely preventable.
Exactly, as well as generational trauma.
Right, absolutely. Joanne, this has been a pleasure. I'm going to pull Rebecca in, and then I'm going to see you in a couple minutes to kind of finish up the dialogue with both of you.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you so much, Joanne. And then, great. So we are going to pull in Rebecca now to give the grassroots kind of perspective. So, hi, Rebecca. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Samantha. Thanks so much for having me.
So I just want to give a brief bio of Rebecca, since I gave a very elegant one for Joanne. So Rebecca is a specialist and trainer in conflict resolution and preventing countering violent extremism, and serves as a senior program manager at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Her work there has focused particularly on Yemen and Pakistan, as well as other parts of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. She's also a consultant on preventing violent extremism to the UN Peacebuilding Fund. She has served as a conflict resolution trainer for the U.S. Department of State's Speaker Program, the Luminary Youth Program, and the Arlington County Jail, and as a facilitator of Western Muslim World Dialogue with Solia, and of American Political Dialogue for Braver Angels. She's also an advisor to the bipartisan leadership and vice chair of the advisory board of the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. She is engaged in cultural exchange, interfaith, educational, peace building, and other initiatives in nearly 60 countries, including Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, Oman, Qatar, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Japan, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Ethiopia, Cuba, Northern Ireland, Australia, and the United States. So Rebecca, so delighted to be here. I've been diving into Rebecca's report on what they've been doing in Yemen, but I just first want to go to this question of how do you deal with a country that's having a humanitarian crisis and people need food now, but then you also have all these other things that you need to rebuild. How do you balance kind of the immediate humanitarian needs with the medium and long-term assistance that could get the country back on its feet?
Yeah, excellent question. So I should first just say quickly, ICRD is an NGO based in DC, which works to prevent and resolve conflict around the world with a focus on the role that religion and religious actors can play in peace building. And we've been working in Yemen for nearly 9 years on a variety of initiatives related to peace building, countering violent extremism, and peace-focused development. And to the question of sort of short-term versus longer-term needs, I think what's helpful is if you can address the immediate humanitarian needs in a way that also promotes sustainability, that builds local capacity for people to carry on those efforts, and that also strategically gets at deeper drivers of conflict. Because if you don't do that, you risk just sort of touching the surface or, temporarily addressing a problem, but then it's going to come back as soon as the assistance goes away. And through our work, we've seen that a lot of Yemenis have more of a desire for humanitarian assistance to go through decentralized local government structures and civil society actors who can, again, if the capacity for them is built so that they know how to take it forward, because they can actually sustain this. They know the local needs, they know where the priority areas are, they know how to distribute equitably, and that's often more sustainable than using sort of temporary structures that are erected, when a foreign donor or a humanitarian initiative comes in temporarily, and then that goes away as soon as the grant or the assistance initiative is over.
So I'm going to stop you right there, Rebecca, for 1 second. So I just want to explain to kind of the audience that's not, in peace building, international relations, what we're talking about. And that's basically the idea that the international community could have a grant for $2 million to go put, let's say it's Médecins Sans Frontières, to go put a hospital in Yemen. But if it's staffed with all Médecins Sans Frontières people and everybody running it as Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders, and there's no local community stakeholders that are equipped to take over the hospital or to be the doctors, once that grant is up from Doctors Without Borders, hospital's gone. Basically, okay, great, we had this nice temporary effect, but it's gone. Or, for example, there's, a lot of governments will get the money to build a pipe, but then the money runs out and there's no one to fix the pipe because there's no more money and they don't train people to fix it. And so then, great, there's a pipe that works for 2 years and then it's just sitting in the ground and it's gone. So it's this idea of bringing in local actors to do, to be part of these international projects so that they last longer than just an initial grant. So yeah, didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to put that in perspective.
No, that's exactly right. Thank you. And there's also ways, to do these humanitarian or development type of projects in a way that also gets at the deeper issues of conflict and peace building, which is ICRD's focus. One dimension to that is if you can involve parties to a conflict, even national parties at the local level, in collaborating on some of these initiatives, and that can be a mechanism of trust building where, the parties might be fighting at a national level, but they've seen that their local affiliates can actually cooperate on building a water system or sewage system. It starts to build those relationships and that trust that, oh, maybe we can actually cooperate on addressing some of the national level issues. Another way of doing this strategically is in the area of countering violent extremism. You mentioned groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are active in some of these areas, and some of them can get support, not really because people necessarily agree with their ideology, which is usually not the case in Yemen, but because they've in cases, offered services like water or electricity or schools or, justice services in the sense of purporting to address a legal dispute that people aren't getting elsewhere. And so what we've done in some of our programming is to engage people who are either former fighters or were deemed vulnerable to potentially being recruited by armed groups in actually implementing and building structures like water and sewage systems. And so this actually gives them a positive role in the community and serves a very critical, immediate humanitarian need, but it also develops, a deeper positive role for people in the community that might otherwise be enticed into joining an armed group.
Mm. So let's dive into the program that actually does with the sort of ICRD. Can you describe, what it?
I that broke up a little, but I think you're asking me to describe our programs in Yemen. So there's sort of two tracks of programming that I can share. One of which is the one I just mentioned about countering violent extremism. And I guess one good example of this is we've worked with local groups of civil society organizations, religious actors, and educators in Yemen in different parts of the country to build their capacity in working to address violent extremism and social cohesion by developing positive alternatives for solving community problems so that people don't need to be tempted to go to armed groups to solve those problems. And so just one quick story to illustrate that. There was a region of southern Yemen that was experiencing a water conflict. Someone had started to build a pipeline to provide water to several villages, but they had to stop partway through because of violence. And so only one village was getting water and the others weren't. And this was creating conflict. This was also a place that Al-Qaeda had occupied right sort of after the Yemeni revolution. And there were some youth in the village that had gone off and joined Al-Qaeda to fight and then decided to leave and come back. And the village elders were concerned about what they were going to do with these people when they came back because they didn't have much education or job skills, and they are afraid that they could radicalize other vulnerable youth in the village. And so one of the community leaders we had trained wanted to do something to address this issue, and we had just a small bit of seed funding to provide for doing a project there. And so with our support, this person worked with the village elders and negotiated with them and the water authorities to get permission to finish the water pipeline. But they engaged the former fighters and other vulnerable youth in actually building the pipeline and installing the infrastructure. And so this gave them not only a tangible job skill that they didn't have before that they could use in the future, but more importantly, it gave them a sort of sense of civic responsibility where they realized that they could play a really important and positive role in helping their community and, this sort of heroic role in identity without having to pick up weapons and fight. And so after this project was implemented and we talked to people in the community about the impact, they said not only did this resolve the water conflict, and similar to what Joanne was mentioning, a lot of boys and girls that had to drop out of school to walk miles every day to get water and were being attacked in some cases were now able to go back to school because now there was a water source. But they said, before this, we used to think that Al-Qaeda was better than our government because when they were here, they were actually giving us these services that the government wasn't. But now through this project, we realized that we don't need Al-Qaeda because we were actually able to solve this problem on our own with cooperating between our elders and youth. And so we're never going to let these militants back in our community. And the youth that were involved in this...
Can we stop for 1 second and just reflect on that they said, we no longer need Al-Qaeda and we're not going to let these militants back in our community. I mean, that's huge. I mean, that is like enormous. I mean, like that's what we're trying. I mean, that's what the U.S. government's been trying to do in terms of CVE, is to get people to own it, versus us going in and being like, here's a flyer, don't hang out with Al Qaeda, they're bad for you. I mean, that's incredible. It's really cool.
Yeah, and that's in this case, this is exactly what I mean by sort of strategic development or humanitarian assistance, because I think to the average Yemeni, if they don't have water or food, that's their primary concern. It's not Al-Qaeda or, these violent extremist groups. It's my kid can't eat or there's no road to go to the hospital. But there's ways that you can address both by addressing these critical immediate needs, but also involving people that might otherwise be enticed by these violent groups in playing a positive role in meeting these needs. And so then you not only make it more sustainable, but you address not only the immediate physical issues, but the deeper issues that people face in terms of, a need for a purpose and belonging and a way to feel like their life has meaning. And part of what we did with this program was that the person we had worked with gave a training for these youth after they built the pipeline in things like mediation skills and peace building and youth leadership. And after that, a number of these youth started their own youth association to promote further youth involvement in the community. And a lot of them went out and actually started resolving conflicts in the community. And one of them said, after this project, now I'm thinking more about how I can be an important person in my community, such as how I can be a mediator. And that's really and they started even mentoring other youth in a neighboring village for how to do this, because they came to them and said, like, how did you guys get water? We want water too. And so it has that sort of ripple multiplier effect. And I can talk about our other program as well, but that's sort of one track we're working on in the sense of addressing violent extremism and building social cohesion by empowering people with the skills to address critical issues in their community, in a way that they take ownership of.
Yeah, I also love because if you look at you've mentioned so many of the factors that are at play that cause people to join armed groups: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. And I know there's, a sense, like, I liked how you said, like, a sense of heroism, especially for men, of sometimes, I did a kind of a bio of a former IS fighter in Syria, and he wanted to protect his family. He wanted to, like, kind of save his country. And now, because in Syria, more of the situation was protection from barrel bombs, but here they have humanitarian disasters. They have no water, they have no food. There's literally, like, kind of a humanitarian war that they need to be protected from, not just the Saudi bombs. And so if you think about, like, orienting this sense of heroism towards, they're still serving and protecting their community, but in a way that's also really tangible. Because you fight in a war, you don't necessarily, like, see an outcome, right? You're like, okay, you killed 5 people, but, like, what did that do, right? But to see that kind of tangible nature of building this, the water structures, or being a mediator and seeing right there, being able to solve a political dialogue and have it come to fruition and mediate a conflict, it's so tangible that, like, I can just see, like, it's almost more powerful than joining an armed group in a way, because they're getting something done that's, like, so tangible. It's like, I did this, I created this, I saved this community. We don't need Al-Qaeda anymore, they've got us.
Exactly.
So I see Joanne nodding her head furiously in the background, so I'm going to bring her back into the conversation. Joanne, we're going to add you into the stream.
I really enjoyed listening to Rebecca. I mean, I love the programs that you're doing and the approach that you're taking.
And why, Joanne? What is it about that strikes you as a U.S. government and a former official?
Because we do certain things, but ultimately, you, Rebecca, your programs reach people on the ground, and that nexus of identities and benefits is tremendously important. And I was nodding my head when you were talking about when people say, we don't need you anymore. I mean, that's ultimately what was successful 10 years ago in Iraq, when the tribes got tired of Al-Qaeda walking in and basically undermining the authority of the leaders. And that was one of the reasons they said, okay, just stay out, you're messing things up. But it does put pressure on people to provide the alternatives, to minimize the frustration and the anger, because otherwise, even though Al-Qaeda never really did much about providing services, ISIS did, but that's a different issue. I'm not a fan of ISIS. It's still, if you don't think that your authorized government is going to do right by you, you are going to be pretty open to other people. And is that the way you see it, Rebecca?
Yeah, because like I said, in Yemen particularly, people that join these violent extremist groups or support them, often it's not so much because they've, been really swayed by their ideology and think, boy, these guys are just fantastic. It's more because, my family's starving, my child is sick, and these people are gonna build a well in my village if I just, let them in, or they're gonna pay me money to go plant a bomb and then I'll be able to feed my family for a month. And it can be really, when you're desperate, when it's a matter of life or death, it can be really hard to say no to that. And so, that's what we try to do with working with community leaders, is to provide positive alternatives so that people aren't in the position that they ever need to make that choice, and so that they will be sustainable initiatives and not just sort of something, we didn't sort of throw money at it and build the water well for them. We empowered them to do it, and now they'll be able to do it again.
Absolutely. It's something, it's an error we sometimes make over and over again, even though within the government and in the NGO community, we have lots and lots of people who understand what you're saying so deeply, but we still don't always do it that way.
Why do we screw it up, Joanne? I mean, why do you think the U.S. government screws it up sometimes?
Well, because what Rebecca's talking about is slow. It involves actually talking to people and going out in the field and helping them. And we not only want to tie the shoelaces, we just want to give them Velcro.
Let's just make this easy and quick and just get it done.
Right. But it's because we're trying to do the right thing. It's just, you have to think about the right thing now as opposed to the right thing down the road.
And I think also, if you invest more time and sometimes resources at the beginning in building the capacity for people on the ground to do that, in the long run, it saves you a lot of time and a lot of resources, because they're not dependent on you to keep providing an infinite supply of money or technical expertise. They've built it within to take it forward themselves. And this particular project with building the water system, I think it was a smaller component of the larger program, but I think we did that portion of it for like less than $10,000, and that changed a whole community. And so if you think of multiplying that by, we're a nonprofit, we're dependent on grant funds and so forth, but if you think of multiplying that all over the country by how much, resources you have, there's so much good that you can do, and it actually becomes a better investment, I think, in the long run, of resources and time.
Yeah, this was not a pitch for ICRD, but I will put the website in case anyone wants to donate, because it is a nonprofit if you want to support their work. I want to kind of end with one question, or I don't know if I'm going to end. We'll see. The role of women. I know both of you have interacted with really incredible Yemeni women and peace builders. I'd love if you could each share a story of kind of women building peace in the region.
Rebecca, you go ahead. I have some stories, but I want to hear yours.
Okay. Gosh, I'm trying to pick just one.
Exactly.
I guess I should say, so the other program the other sort of track of programs that I didn't speak about as much before was focused on sort of bridging the gap that sometimes exists between communities at the grassroots level in Yemen and higher level government officials. And so another program we did was designed to bring together Yemeni communities, men and women, to sort of talk about and prioritize their most important needs and strategize on ways to communicate those needs to higher level decision makers, including those that could influence, national level peace talks. And then to take steps in the interim to, kind of like we did with the other project, to address some of these needs themselves through seed funding and community work.
Figure out the needs, figure out the advocacy strategy, and then figure out how to meet short-term needs. Is that right?
Yeah, so like ultimately you want the government to be aware of what you need and be in a position to be able to do it on a larger scale. But in the interim, what can we as a community do to take steps toward that? And so through these dialogues, there were a lot of issues that were brought up. Through this other program, we funded about 13 different community projects, and a number of them focused on issues, particularly of women's education. One of them was in a school where there were not functioning bathrooms. And so for girls especially, who can't just go outside in the trees like boys might be able to, this was leading to parents keeping their girls home from school because they didn't want them in that position that they have to be there for 8 hours without a bathroom. Also just matters of hygiene, of not having a functioning sink. And so that was one of the projects we funded. Two other ones dealt with building a sort of wall around the courtyard of a girls' school so that girls could go outside for activities, because when they were going out there without any protection, not only were some of them getting sick from heat stroke, but they were being harassed by some of the men in the neighborhood who could see them from their buildings, and just harass them. And for that reason also, parents didn't want to send their girls to school. And through some of these dialogues, the communities had to sort of prioritize, okay, there's a fixed amount of seed funding that we're receiving from this NGO. What project do we want to do for it? And some of the women were really powerful advocators for these issues, such as the women's schools, and actually got the majority, including a lot of the men, to vote for doing those projects, which they did. So that was really encouraging to see. And in one of them, of one of the schools, after this sort of veranda was built, one of the students' parents was so just inspired by that they actually took from their own resources, they donated to the school to build an extra classroom to address the issue of overcrowding, which is something that we didn't have budget to do in our program. And so, again, it's a sort of ripple effect that it inspires other action. And with a number of these projects, like there was another project that was repairing a sewage system to reduce the spread of disease. And one of the local women stepped up and actually led that project. And she said things like, this is my first time doing this. I never thought I could be a leader and do something like this. But now I realize I can, and people are actually listening to me. And, I'm seeing the benefits of how this is affecting the community. And I was just really inspired by that. And I hope we'll be able to do more and more of this in the future, because these are just really amazing people, and it's really been an honor and a privilege to support them however we can.
So cool. Joanne, tell us your stories.
Well, I could tell stories about some of the known women leaders, but I'm not going to, because you can Google them. The story that I'd like to tell is about a program, and I think it was NDI, but that's not important, where they were working with women on developing problem-solving skills, conflict resolution skills, and they brought together Yemeni and Saudi women. And you have to remember that virtually all gender measures in Yemen are the worst in the Middle East and pretty low for the world. They get less food, they get less medical care, they are less educated. So the Saudis certainly did not expect much of the Yemeni women. But in the exercises they did, the Yemeni women were far more successful, far more clear in what they were saying, far more capable of finding compromises and moving the process forward. And it was a reminder that we often make assumptions about women based on measures that we measure because we can, not because they're the best way to assess whether women are going to be able to play a significant role or not. Because during Arab Spring, there were a lot of women out there organizing and out there in the squares.
I was just thinking about a story about my friend Iman, who during the Arab Spring in Egypt, she actually saw a guy like assaulting a woman, and she came out of her house and she beat him up. A little different than conflict resolution negotiation. It was just like, absolutely not. Like, I am not letting this. She is amazing. I mean, Iman, I love you. But yeah, I mean, that people don't think that they have these skills, and that's reflected as well. You know, I remember learning about the criteria to become. There's been so few UN peace envoys that are women. And it's because a lot of the criteria is that you had to have been an ambassador, had to have been a government official, whereas some of these grassroots community leaders are amazing at conflict resolution and consensus building and all the things you would need to be a UN special envoy, but they don't, the criteria basically rules them out.
Well, the criteria were written by men.
Right, the criteria were written by men, for men, and it needs to change. So this has been a privilege, a pleasure. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure my audience has learned a lot. Rebecca, I want to thank you so much. Joanne, I want to thank you so much for being on with us today. You know, I will continue to watch your work. Rebecca, I've put the ICRD.org is the organization that she works for, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. You're welcome, James, into the chat so you can support the amazing work that they're doing. And Joanne, is there anything that you want to promote or people to keep an eye
on? I wish I had thought about that in advance. No, not right now.
Well, I'd like to see Joanne be appointed an ambassador to one of the Middle East countries. So that's what I'm hoping for. So we'll see. So anyway, I'm going to pull both of you out, but it was such a pleasure. And you're both welcome to remain in the virtual studio for 1 second so we can debrief.
Thank you so much for having us. It's really been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. All right. So that was amazing. So that was Rebecca Cataldi of International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, who manages their Yemen programming, and Joanne Cummings, a very storied Foreign Service officer who served as the Political and Econ Chief at the U.S. Embassy in Yemen. Both really amazing, amazing women. I feel so privileged to have had them on the show. So I really want to thank them for their time and their unique perspective on global politics that I think we often don't get. I also want to thank Stream Inspectors for producing the show, all the beautiful graphics and images of globes and dancing purple things. I don't know how to do that. Stream Inspectors does an amazing job producing the show. So I want to really thank Zach and Megan for doing the amazing production on this show. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode of Samanthropolitics, we are looking now for like-minded sponsors. You can send us a message on the Samanthropolitics Facebook page if you're interested, or just DM me on whatever social media platform you're able to find me on. But we are looking for like-minded sponsors. And lastly, if you want to become an amazing woman leader like Joanne or like Rebecca, I host a Women's Leadership Challenge, which is an amazing course, 8 women each, where we learn from one another in each other's leadership challenges. You can go to that at www.empowerglobal.net/new-online-challenge, and I'll have that put in the chat too in order to apply. We only have 3 spots left in our cohort that's starting in March. So for all of the aspiring women leaders out there who want to get to that next level and be unapologetically amazing like these 2 ladies, I would really encourage you to apply. So mark your calendars, next Wednesday, 8 p.m., next episode of Samanthropolitics. And until then, have a great week, everyone. Take care.